The original vision of this series, put forward in 1997 in an interview with Yoshiki Okamoto, was to create Sengoku Biohazard, a feudal-era style version of Resident Evil. It would be set during the Sengoku period inside a mansion full of traps, etc., that was very similar to the mansion of the first Resident Evil. Instead of guns, you would have melee weapons. It appeared to be more action-focused than the survival style of Resi, while maintaining a vibe of horror and isolation. Originally, Sengoku Biohazard was being developed for the PlayStation 1 and was apparently about 50% complete before the project was cancelled entirely. According to the developers, they felt the release of the PS2 was too close to when they would finish the original title and decided to move it onto the new console. In January 2001, Onimusha Warlords was released for the PlayStation 2. Following its release, Onimusha achieved high popularity, becoming the first PS2 game to reach 1 million sales. This video is a love letter from me to this weird and, I think anyway, still pretty great franchise. There are some outliers, but overall I think this series shows Capcom in one of their great experimental stages, exploring new possibilities on more powerful hardware. The games are set in feudal Japan during the Sengoku period and follows every weeb's #1 historical figure, Oda Nobunaga. Except he dies? No, instead it focuses on the samurai Samanosuke Akechi for this first game. After Nobunaga's death in battle, Samanosuke and his pal Kaede go on a quest to save a princess who was kidnapped by demons for some reason. They end up at a fancy castle. Sam gets a magic gauntlet, fights a lot of demons, hijinks ensue, and many lessons are learned. This first game takes place over the course of one night, leading up to the resurrection of a demon lord. That's pretty much it for the story of this one, to be honest. It's basic and it's predictable, but I think it has that nice campy edge that a lot of these older Capcom games have. More on the story and the characters later. First off, I think this game looks pretty damn impressive, even today. The lovely pre-rendered backgrounds are just bursting with detail, from the intimidating structures of the castle exterior, the gooey dripping basement full of unknowable horrors, to a serene garden, full of additional horror. It's clear that they transplanted some of the aspects over from the prototype, but used the advantages of the PS2 to have a higher resolution background, as well as having the memory for more detailed FMV cutscenes, a trend that will be the cornerstone of why the third game is especially remembered. A lot of the time, more of these monstery aspects of the art are quite fleshy. It's pretty much a hard rule that when you enter Demon Town, everything gets all wet and meaty. I love the music in this game. Each track is wonderfully captured and it's perfect for setting the tone of the environment you're in. The game's orchestral music is credited in-game to composer Mamoru Samuragochi. To record it, Samuragochi browbeat the producers into employing a 200-piece orchestra, including musicians playing such traditional instruments as a shakuhachi and the taiko drum. However, he did admit in 2014 that he directed his orchestrator, Takashi Nigaki, to ghostwrite the music for the game, for which Samuragochi took full credit for the composition. Very naughty boy! Although quite compressed, there are a lot of unique Foley sounds too, whether it's the thudding of Sam's feet on the shiny wooden floors to the distinctive scrape of a demon ninja's arm blades. The sound direction is on point throughout. The core gameplay is very similar to that of the earlier Resident Evil series, namely fixed camera, tank controls, puzzle solving, safe rooms, documents, and interacting with everything. As I mentioned before, this game is much more action-focused when compared to its spiritual cousin. You have your basic attacks and magic, which are used to bonk those rascals on the head and make your way to wherever the narrative takes you. Surprisingly, Onimusha inadvertently inspired another action title mechanic in the then forthcoming Devil May Cry. Some of the major gameplay elements were partially inspired by a bug found in Onimusha. During a test play, Hideki Kamiya discovered that enemies could be kept in the air by slashing them repeatedly, which led to the inclusion of juggles by gunfire and sword strikes in Devil May Cry. There is a mechanic vital to why I think this series was unique: souls, and their subsequent absorption for cold hard cash.
Your soul is mine.
That's right, blood capitalism. By beating enemies, they drop juicy souls, and you have to actively hoover them up using your magic gauntlet before they bugger off forever. You can then use these as XP to level up the weapons, medicine, and keys collected on your way through the game. Back when I was a babby boy, the tension of fighting these hordes of spooky beasties and finding gaps amidst battle to scoop up the XP before it disappeared created a very different tactical approach to combat. Of course, a disappearing drop system is a staple of game design, but I feel that this active engagement of making yourself vulnerable just to get that sweet juice always kept you focused and wary of your positioning. Another feature of combat is the Isen system. This is pretty much an instant kill, except you can enact it whenever you please, provided your reaction speeds are up to the task. There are two types, parry and counter. Parry requires you to deflect an attack at exactly the right time and hit the standard attack button immediately afterwards to perform an instant kill. Counter has largely the same timing, except you bypass blocking like a damn coward and just swing away. The best way to time it is by using a telltale sound cue from a monster strike. It takes quite a bit of practice to nail the timing, especially with how fast and unpredictable some of the enemy roster can be, but once you can perform it on some of the lesser demons, it's incredibly satisfying to just blast through them and be rewarded with more delicious souls for your efforts. I feel this rather simple mechanic can often be completely ignored by those who just want to wail on beasties, and that's okay too, but mastering it can really change the flow of combat. Patiently waiting for those skeleton boys to just rattle over to you and then BAM! Either I'm not good enough to counter bosses, or you can't do it. You're welcome to try. The weapons themselves are your basic fare.
This is the scraper, this is the poker, and this happy little fellow is the gouger.
Lightning Boy, nicely balanced between speed and damage. Big Flame Boy, which is your monster slapper. And Speedy Wind Boy, which is quick and slicey. Each weapon has a unique moveset and a magic attack, governed by an independent magic meter, as well as different timings for the Isen system. You level them up by injecting souls into them at save points, which increases their overall damage, as well as having a sexy new look each time. It's not altogether necessary to upgrade the weapon's base damage if you don't want to, but I guess in order to prevent people just scuttling past enemies, there are hard progress locks that look like delightful, pulsating, multicoloured buttholes that bar your path. You have to upgrade the orb of your weapon, which is a separate upgrade path, in order to correspond with the number of butts on the wall. I think this is fair because it encourages you to participate in combat and defeat a certain number of enemies to get you through to the next part of the game. To new players, it's also a handy guide to indicate that sweet, tasty progress without being too overt. Back in 2001, we didn't have much by the way of weapon change mechanics. Instead, we had to use a nice menu system. It's clunky and it's obtuse, but it does have some nice item portraits and nostalgic sound effects. As some of you may notice, I'm playing the HD remaster of Onimusha 1, and the team included a quick weapon change mechanic. It dramatically changes the pacing of the game, saving you diving in and out of menus every time you want to slap a monster with a different pointy stick. Speaking of monsters, I think there's a pretty decent variety of enemies in the game. You have your regular fodder, big boys, bigger boys, and flying assholes. You can Isen pretty much all of them, provided you learn the timing of their attacks, and it still feels amazing when you have a mini-duel with the last one standing. Of course, no Capcom game would be complete without bosses. These range from big and chunky to nice and dually. While none of these stand out massively to me, there is one exception that got me hyped up the moment I realised I was fighting it. This big lad is probably my favourite fight of the whole game. Instead of him being a meat sponge, he challenges you to manoeuvre tactically and carefully plan when you try and give him a smack. That and the wonderfully cliché setting for a boss battle. It's even great when he straight up ditches his shield and goes full tilt at you. Let's have a look at puzzles next. Throughout the game, you'll notice these very interactable boxes. Give them a prod, and you'll be greeted with a little challenge before you can crack it open and feast on the goo inside. There are two types, number rotation and codex. The former is simple enough, you just have to do the classic slidey Capcom puzzle with a number sequence. The second type, however, requires a bit more rooting around the castle for excerpts of a codex, which you can then return to the chest and figure it out. Puzzle boxes are a staple of the Onimusha series, and now I'm an adult, I can happily say I like them. If you're not the kind of person that enjoys puzzles, it's very easy to bounce off and get quite annoyed with them. This is especially noticeable around the 25% mark, when you have to take a mandatory sequence of puzzles, which the finale of which is a damned slidey timed. There are two sections where you play as our bulgy-eyed boy's helpful partner, Kaede. She's a ninja who doesn't believe in armour or keeping warm apparently. Both of the times that you take control of her, she's pulling Sam's ass out of a scrape, rather than needing to be rescued herself, which for the time is quite refreshing. However, don't assume this series passes the Bechdel test, as basically all of her interactions with another female character are about Sam. She's noticeably speedier than her armoured counterpart, replete with throwing knives and backflips. The only problem is, there's no incentive to fight the enemies. You can't absorb souls, and healing items are shared between the two playable characters, and there's no point in engaging in combat unless it's a requirement to proceed. It's a shame because she really is fun to control. She is a mini-boss which is essentially a demon version of her, and it can be quite a challenge. Like most early Capcom adventure games, Onimusha is pretty scant on characters. Samanosuke's character model and Japanese voice actor is actor Takeshi Kaneshiro. The Onimusha series always aimed to have popular actors in the leading roles, but not all of them were necessarily Japanese. We've already met Kaido, she's pretty great. Princess Yuki, however, is unfortunately relegated to damsel duty. She isn't given much to do other than be kidnapped, swoon, be kidnapped again, from inside a prison cell, and sacrificed. It's a real shame that the only other female character in the game, that's not just a boss, adheres to these tropes, but don't worry, moving forward with the series we will be seeing more female characters kick some serious ass. There's this stupid kid who keeps getting himself into trouble, but has plot armour coming out of every part of his body, despite the fact that everyone else in the vicinity has turned to strawberry jam. There's Tokichiro, who is introduced trying to wrestle that stupid kid for some reason, but gets overpowered by a child. Idiot. This chap is always trying to get our boy Sam to join Team Demon. Out of all the English voice actors in the game, I think the best one is Tokichiro. He really sells a performance and has a bit of fun with it too. We have Demon Scientist, who isn't named as far as I'm aware. This cheeky chap is always entertaining. Look at his spooky design! He turns up to gloat every so often throughout the game and just buggers off at some point near the end of the story. He will return as an antagonist in the third and final game. And then there's this guy. If you try and talk to him, he normally ignores you. However, around the 95% mark, you are prompted to try again. This time, he offers to whisk you away to the Demon Realm. This is the last part of the gameplay that I feel is worth talking about. The Demon Realm is a series of rooms with different enemy layouts which you fight through in order to reach the bottom, where a deliciously overpowered reward is waiting for you. The enemies start off familiar, but are soon deployed in different formations to which you're used to. It's a purely optional challenge, but they put tons of work into designing the fleshy, toothy, living rooms that you struggle through. Another neat part is that you have to watch your healing items. The last boss is coming up, and you don't want to munch down on all your delicious herbs. Like the Roof Boy, it's a real test of how well you know the combat system. To me, this is the true final boss of the game. This optional challenge will persist throughout all of the mainline Onimusha titles, and remains a very memorable section of each game for me. There's not much point in covering the last boss in any great detail, as he's pretty easy. What's much more interesting, to me at least, is the ending. After beating the big bad, our boy Sam is trapped as the castle collapses around him. Some blood gets in your demon juice vacuum and he transforms into a Dragon Ball Z state and presses the win button. But it appears it was all too late, and Nobunaga was resurrected after all! After the credits, we see a stinger showing a certain familiar gauntlet, its owner walking away into Sequel Town. In the PS2 version, we were also treated to a little trailer for the sequel. They had the absolute nads to show a very rough looking snap of the next instalment. We see a new, eye-patch protagonist fighting some more beasties, hear the same sound effects, as well as some concept art for new characters. Again, this blew my tiny mind at the time, especially since the sequel was coming out the following year in Europe. That about wraps it up for Onimusha Warlords. While the game may be rough in its execution by today's standards, it set a blueprint for an ambitious blend of action and horror. It's the very DNA of some of our favourite action games today. I look forward in particular to gushing about the next game, which will always have a special place in my heart. See you then.